Fashion Week has just kicked off within Pokémon GO, and this is one of the most popular events that we have every year. There's going to be a ton of costume Pokémon that you're going to be seeing in the wild as well as raid battles, and there's a few that you will want to catch. I'm going to be talking about all of this in today's video. Let's get right into it. Alright, how's it going everyone? It's me, it's Count Jinsula. I hope you're having a good day, and welcome to today's Pokemon GO video. Alright, so we need to talk about Fashion Week. This is one of the most popular events within the Pokemon GO community, and it's specifically because it is full of costume Pokemon, some of which are only going to be available during Fashion Week. So naturally, a lot of players go really hard during this event. But of course, it's not just the costume Pokemon that you will want to focus in on. There are a couple of Pokemon that will be appearing in the wild as well as raid battles that are actually going to have some really strong gameplay implications. So let's go over every single Pokemon that will be featured during this event and talk about whether or not they are worth going after. Alright, let's start off by talking about what Pokemon are going to be making their debut during Fashion Week. First and foremost, we got Dragonite wearing a fashionable costume. And I have to tell you, this costume is actually really cute on Dragonite. Like, giving him some sunglasses and a bow tie, that's something I never would have thought of. But yeah, hand it to Niantic, this is a really cool addition, and it looks like it's only going to be available in raids, which I'll get into later. But yeah, this is definitely one of the Pokemon that you will want to go after, considering that you can potentially get the shiny form of this costume Pokemon, and it's also pre-evolved. So you're going to be able to get a lot of Dratini candy and Dratini XL candy. On top of that, Dragonite is one of those Pokemon that's just all around really good in Pokemon GO. It's basically a timeless dragon type Pokemon, and it's going to be really good for both raid battles as well as with PvP. Therefore, this is definitely one of the Pokemon that you will want to go after. It's probably going to be worth it to do a couple of these in a raid, especially if you have a bunch of premium raid passes just lying around. Next up, we also have Wooper wearing a fashionable costume that's going to be debuting during this event. And it's also going to have its evolved form Quagsire wearing a fashionable costume. Now, what more can be said about Quagsire? This Pokemon is still one of the best that you can have in the Great League. And it did recently get a Community Day move, which you will probably have to get through an Elite Charge TM. But still, Quagsire is definitely a Pokemon you could go after. My suggestion is that you catch a bunch of Wooper, hope for one with PvP IVs, and then save it so that you could evolve it during the December Community Day. Because during that Community Day, any Wooper that you evolve is going to give you the exclusive moves, so you don't have to use any Elite Charge TMs. Also, real quick, let's go over the bonuses for this event. There's going to be select avatar items that will be on sale during Fashion Week. There's also going to be 2 times the amount of candy for catching Pokemon, and you'll have an increased chance of getting Candy XL for catching Pokemon. So make sure you fully utilize that bonus, because some of the Pokemon that you get during this event are actually going to be really good. And there's going to be a couple that will give you guaranteed XL candy. We'll get more into that later. But there's also going to be a timed paid research during this event, and it's going to be $2 USD or the equivalent pricing in your local currency, and it's going to give you 2 premium battle passes as well as Pokemon wearing costumes. So again, this could be an avenue for you to get some high IV versions of some of these costume Pokemon, so it's something worth considering. Alright, now let's talk about the wild encounters, and yeah, there's a bunch of these that are actually worth going after. First and foremost, there's going to be Pikachu with a Summer Flare. This is a Pikachu costume that is timeless. It's a very classic one, and it's making its return during this event. And yeah, gameplay implications wise, it's not necessarily that important to catch Pikachu. Of course, if you're going for your Pikachu fan medal, then yes, this Pokemon is definitely worth catching. But aside from that, there's no reason for you to go hard at catching a bunch of Pikachu. You can evolve these Pikachu into Raichu, and it's also going to have the costume, so that is something you should keep in mind if you're a collector. Next, there's going to be Diglett wearing a fashionable costume. And yeah, in terms of gameplay implications, nothing too special here. But it is a Diglett wearing a fedora, so I don't know if that's something that tickles your fancy, but if it is, then it's worth catching in that regard. And then we already talked about Wooper wearing a fashionable costume. That's going to be a wild spawn during this event, so if you want that particular Pokemon, just make sure you go look for it in the wild. But we're also going to get Croagunk wearing a fashionable costume. And this is a costume version of Croagunk that made its debut 2 years ago, and I have to say it's one of the most popular versions of this Pokemon. And yes, the shiny form is going to be available, so if you want yourself a good trade chip, then make sure you go out and try to catch as many Croagunk as possible, because you might hit lucky and get a shiny version of this costume version. And then we're also going to be seeing Gothita in the wild, and its shiny form is going to be making its debut during this event. Now, there's no real gameplay implications behind Gothita and any of its evolutions, so this is a Pokemon you don't necessarily need to care about. If anything, it's only going to be good for its new shiny form, because that will certainly draw a lot of trades from friends, but otherwise, it's just basically going to be there for you to show off. Next up, we also have the female version of Frillish that'll be in the wild, and this is a Pokemon that unfortunately does not evolve into anything good. Like, yeah, it is still going to be decent in the Great League, but I would say that the male version is going to be slightly better. And that is also going to be spawning in the wild, but it's going to be more uncommon. Next up, we got Furfrou. This is another Pokemon that's more of a collector's item. I wouldn't say Furfrou is going to be that important during this event, but it is one of the only events where you can get this Pokemon in mass. So if you're looking for some of the trims in order to boost up your collection, then yeah, maybe you can go out and catch a bunch of Furfrou. And then we're going to have Mareanie spawning in the wild, and this is a Pokemon that actually is pretty underrated in the Go Battle League, specifically its evolved form Toxapex. I've been actually using Toxapex in a lot of different leagues, and I have to say it's a very powerful Pokemon depending on how good it is in the certain metas. Like in some specialty cups where it is allowed, like I would actually say it's one of the best Pokemon to use. It's basically an anti-fairy Pokemon, and it's also very bulky. So if you are looking for a really good Pokemon for the Great League, then farm up Mareanie and hope for those PvP IVs. Now also spawning in the wild, but they're going to be a little bit more uncommon, includes Absol wearing a fashionable costume. It's basically Absol with the sunglasses, and I would say you should not ignore them when you see them on screen because Absol does have a perma boosted shiny rate. So if you want yourself a shiny costume Pokemon, this could be the one that you could go after during this event. And I already mentioned it earlier, but Frillish, the male version, is also going to be spawning in the wild, but it's going to be a lot more uncommon. But the male version of Frillish does evolve into a Pokemon that's going to be good for the Great League. So if you want yourself a really good ghost type or a water type for the Great League, then maybe you should go out and catch a bunch of Frillish. Alright, now let's talk about what Pokemon are going to be spawning in raids. And yeah, most of these are actually available in the wild, so you do not necessarily have to go after them, but there's going to be some that will be exclusive to raid battles. In 1-star raids, we're going to have Diglett wearing a fashionable costume, Wooper wearing a fashionable costume, Sneasel wearing a fashionable costume, and Furfrou. And I would say out of these four, Sneasel wearing a fashionable costume is going to be the one you would want to go for. Mainly because this is going to be an event exclusive, and on top of that, it's only going to be available in 1-star raids, and its evolved form is a really good ice-type raid attacker. Now, in 3-star raids, we're going to have Butterfree wearing a fashionable costume, Dragonite wearing a fashionable costume, Kirlia wearing a fashionable costume, and Absol wearing a fashionable costume. All four of these are actually worth your raid passes, at least the free daily one, mainly because Butterfree wearing a fashionable costume is a very popular shiny, and this is going to be your only opportunity to get it. And then of course we already talked about Dragonite. This is going to be your only way of getting this fashionable Pokemon, and I have to say this Pokemon is definitely going to be popular in the future. And then you got Kirlia wearing a fashionable costume. This is something that I'm a little bit irked by because Kirlia with a costume is something that typically is spawning in the wild within these events, and it's a great way for you to get Stardust and a bunch of Routes candy, but this time it looks like it's going to be locked behind raids, and that's very unfortunate. Now, in terms of the Pokemon that are going to be spawning in eggs, we're going to have Pichu with Summer Flare, Wooper wearing a fashionable costume, Smoochum wearing a fashionable costume, Shinx wearing a fashionable costume, and Gothita. And then during this event, Gothita is going to have an increased shiny chance when you hatch it from eggs. So if you want this particular shiny, then I would suggest hatching as many 5-kilometer eggs as you can during this event. And then finally, let's talk about what's going to be appearing in field research tasks. Again, these are a bunch of Pokemon that are going to be available everywhere else, but if you want a free-to-play method of getting some of these Pokemon that are going to be exclusive in raids, then field research tasks is a great avenue for you to do that. You're going to see Butterfree wearing a fashionable costume, Diglett wearing a fashionable costume, Wooper wearing a fashionable costume, Kirlia wearing a fashionable costume, Shinx wearing a fashionable costume, and Blitzel wearing a fashionable costume. The costume version of Blitzel is only going to be available from field research tasks, so if you still do not have that Pokemon from last year, then make sure you go out and complete as many field research tasks as you can. Alright, so there you have it. These are all the Pokemon that will be available during this event, and I have to say, this roster of Pokemon is actually really good. Even though the highlight is all about the costume Pokemon, there's still quite a few Pokemon that will be really good for both PvP and raid battles. I really hope you found this video to be helpful, and if there's a particular Pokemon that you are specifically going to be going after, make sure you talk about it in the comment section down below, and let's have a great discussion. And thank you so much for making it to this point in the video. If you found it to be informative and helpful, make sure you hit that thumbs up button and subscribe if it's your first time here, and don't forget that little bell so you can stay up to date on whenever I upload videos. And I want to give a quick shout out to all of my patrons on Patreon. You make this channel content possible. If you want to support my channel in any way, big or small, then make sure you go and check out the links in the description below. For all my patrons, they get a permanent spot on my in-game friends list. So if you want to interact with me in some way within Pokemon Go, like with remote raids or the friendship system, then make sure you go and check out my Patreon. Also, if you want to support my channel without spending any money, you can do so by following me on social media. My handle is @Jinsula, and I'm on the following platforms. Alright, and that's going to be it. I'm Jinsula. Be safe, have fun, love yourself, and I'll catch you all later.